If you leave your closet door closed tonight, remember this. Some doors are closed to keep things out, and others are closed because something on the other side prefers it that way. Tonight you will hear 50 reported accounts, short, cold-blooded little slices of the uncanny, each told as witnesses described them. Some are verified by more than one source, some remain stubbornly personal. All are listeners' reports. All came to us as someone's memory of a night that refused to make sense. These are not urban legends. These are people who went to bed and woke with a new, unexplained fact in their lives. A smell that didn't belong, a child's voice beneath the stairs, a doll that did not stay where it had been put. I'll tell each one the way it was given, a short tag for context, the account in an intimate tone, sometimes quoting a line the witness still hears in their head, and a small closing beat that leaves the image in the room with you. If one of these stories is speaking to you, stay till the end of this section. If you love true horror, hit subscribe. New compilations every week. Domestic hauntings, closets, bedrooms, dolls. Homes are supposed to be predictable. These stories say otherwise. A teenage girl in a small suburban home. She says it began with the closet light. For months, the bulb would be on in the morning when it had been off before bed. She would stand at her bedroom door and listen. Silence, then a tiny scratch, as if fingernails traced wood. One night she opened the closet and found her older jacket slashed in neat, looping cuts. No blood, just the fabric frayed like paper. She slept on the sofa after that. The scratch kept timing itself with the second she dropped into sleep. Her final note? She moved out the next summer, and the landlord replaced the closet door. A mother in a 2-story ranch. Her toddler woke at 3 a.m., pointing into the hallway. The mother remembered the sound, a low, steady humming like a music box. She carried the child to the hall and found both nursery doors closed. The music stopped as soon as she flipped on the light. Later, checking the video from the baby monitor, she says she watched one clip over and over. The toddler sitting up, smiling, talking to something just out of frame. The audio picked up a tiny, wrong-sounding lullaby under the baby's voice. The child still hums the tune sometimes, and the mother keeps a cup of salt by the nursery door now. A man renting a room in an old boarding house. He remembers being shaken awake by the smell of cigarettes in a non-smoker's room. He woke to see a tiny silhouette standing between the wardrobe and the dresser, a child no taller than his knee. He insists the figure was solid enough for him to feel a cold draft envelop his legs. When he switched on the bedside lamp, the shape dissolved into dust motes. The final note. The fingernail marks found later on the inside of the wardrobe door were never explained. A young couple in a newly bought Victorian. They reported footsteps above them for weeks, pacing at 2 in the morning, slowing at the same spot near the attic hatch. They pulled the hatch open once and found a single small handprint on the underside of the hatch door, as if someone had pressed and then wiped away. Their dog would sit by the stairs and stare up, growling softly at nothing. After months they sold the house quietly. The realtor called it character in the listing. The house sold again a year later, a middle-aged woman living alone. She says the bedroom felt colder than the rest of the apartment. One night, blanket pulled to her chin, she felt breath on her face, warm, then gone. She sat up, and the dresser mirror showed a child's reflection standing behind her chair, too small to be a visitor, and too clear to be a trick of light. She claims she reached, and the reflection's hand seemed to touch the glass from the inside. The mirror was later found with a single hairline crack running through the surface. She keeps that mirror covered now. A boy in a duplex with thin walls. He remembers his closet door banging in the night, hard enough to rattle the picture frames. Each time he opened the door to find nothing, his socks were gone, one sock from every pair. Months later, The missing socks turned up draped across the closet rod, tied into knots. He swore he never did it. His mother believed him and threw the tied socks away. The boy keeps 3 unmatched socks in a shoebox just in case. A grandmother in a farmhouse. She woke to the sound of a wooden music box closing. It lived in the parlor. She had wound it that afternoon. When she shuffled in, the music box was closed, and the tiny ballerina lay face down inside, hair tangled as if another hand had played with it. Her grandson, who had been visiting, swore he hadn't touched it. She insists she found a small footprint, a child-size print, on the back of the music box the next morning. She took the box to the attic and hasn't opened it since. A 13-year-old sharing a room with her sister. She says the closet door would slowly swing open at night. Once she woke to a cold voice whispering, "Come play," right by her ear. The sister saw nothing and blamed sleepwalking. One night the younger girl's favorite doll was found hanging by its hair from the closet rod. No one could explain how the doll's hair, synthetic and short, had been tied into a noose. The older sister swears she still wakes at the sight of any doll. A college student living off campus. During a week of final exams, he reported objects vanishing from his desk and appearing in odd places. His calculator in the bathtub, his pen jar outside his bedroom window. The climax came when his phone recorded itself turning on at 3 a.m. and played a low, muffled voice saying, "Stop studying." He shows the recording to friends. Their reactions vary from a laugh to a quick, uncomfortable glance around his apartment. He moved the desk against the wall and stopped leaving his door open. A woman in a second-floor apartment. She says she discovered a line of small scratches on the inside of the closet wall, as though someone had crawled along it. The scratches formed a crude arrow pointing down to the carpet. That night, the carpet looked as if something had been dragged toward the closet and stopped. She pulled up the corner and found a child's drawing tucked between floorboards. A stick figure smiling, drawn with a hand that pressed hard into the paper. She taped it to the closet door and sleeps with the closet light on. Host Bridge. Houses keep secrets. Sometimes the secret stays inside the house. Sometimes it follows you. Poltergeist and object activity. Things that should be still, not violent, that behave otherwise. A single mother in a 2-bedroom flat. She reported plates shattering in the middle of the night, not falling, but splitting like wet paper where they've been sitting on the counter for years. Once, a wooden chair slid across the kitchen by itself and stopped at the child's high chair. She says she found messages written on steamed-up windows in looping, childish letters. Go, and then stay. Her daughter refused to sleep in her room for a month. The mother says she still dreams of plates cracking under invisible pressure. A mail carrier on a rural route. He says he delivered through fog and fields, but on one winter morning he walked away from a mailbox and heard a thud like a fist on tin. He glanced back to see the mailbox door swing open and a bundle of old letters he had just delivered fall out, scattered as if someone on the other side of the road had thrown them. When he bent to pick them up, each one had a child's drawing tucked inside, crayoned suns and stick people. He keeps one drawing pinned to his locker. Its smile seems too precise to be accidental. A homeowner with new, smart electronics. She reported her smart TV switching channels on its own, always landing on an old children's program that hadn't aired in years. One night it stopped on an episode mid-sentence. The narrator's voice slowed, and the words reoriented into a whisper that clearly said the woman's name. She unplugged the set and found the screen left with a single, damp fingerprint on the glass. She sold the TV the next week. A teenage boy at his dad's house during renovations. Said tools would move between the basement and the garage with no one carrying them. Hammers appeared on the stair landing, wrenches balanced on the back of chairs. Once the radio turned itself on and played a static laced station. Between the fuzz, a voice counted 1, 2, 3, then stopped. They found scratch marks on the back of a workbench, as if nails had been run along the wood from left to right. The dad blamed sleep deprivation. The boy kept a small magnet in his pocket to check his hangers at night. A young woman in a studio apartment. She woke to heavy thuds from the kitchen, the sound of pots falling. Rolling over, she saw one pot hovering a few inches above the stove, swinging slowly and then dropping without a sound that should have been there. She recorded a few minutes of the ceiling fan blade moving in a rhythm that matched her pulse. In the morning, a cluster of pennies lay in a circle on the stove, shiny and uncorroded. She thought of the pennies as a calling card and stopped cooking for weeks. A couple renovating an old schoolhouse. They reported desks and chairs rearranging themselves while they slept. In the morning, desks formed neat rows that faced the hallway instead of the blackboard. The wife found tiny eraser crumbs spelled into a name they didn't know. Once, the chalkboard wrote a single line in a child's hand, "We are still here." They chalked over it, and the line reappeared the next day, exactly the same. A man whose cabinets banged at night. He says the sound would roll through the kitchen at 3 in the morning and stop at the same cabinet every time. When he opened it, everything inside had been moved, bowls stacked into a tower, cups placed in a precise concentric circle. One night, he found a single small shoe wedged between plates. He left the kitchen light on for a week afterward and kept a camera pointed at the cabinets. The footage showed a shadow brushing past the frame, nothing more. The shoe is in a box in his closet now. A woman living above an antiques shop. She reported that objects she'd never owned would appear in her flat. A porcelain cup on her bedside table, a spool of thread at the foot of her bed. Each item smelled faintly of the shop below, mothballs and lemon oil, though she never left the lid open. The shopkeeper told her some items carry memories. She didn't ask what kind. She put the items back in boxes and labeled them with dates. A teacher in a suburban elementary school. She said the classroom music box would start while the room was empty and the blinds drawn. Once the teacher walked in at dawn and found all the students' desks turned to face the door. There were fingerprints in chalk dust on the windowsill, small and powdery. She believes the same thing that tapped the windows during recess is the thing that runs and hides in the back of the room when after-school lights go off. She began locking supplies in a cabinet. The cabinet would rattle itself to be opened, a woman renting a basement studio. She woke to her dresser drawers all pulled out, lined side by side across the floor. Inside each drawer was a single chopped strand of hair, tied with red thread. The property manager came and sealed the locks for a week, attributing it to pranksters. She stopped answering the knock on the door at odd hours and started carrying a tiny flashlight in her pocket. She places the drawers back in order each morning and counts the strands like a ritual. A delivery driver who lived alone. He reported headlights in the driveway at irregular hours. Cars that would fade into nothing while his engine was cold. Once, a folded note appeared under his windshield wiper with the words, "We like the way you park." No signature. He started parking in a different spot and still found notes in the morning. One on his kitchen table, another in the pocket of a jacket he hadn't worn. He keeps the notes in a drawer, unread. Hostbridge. Objects tell different stories than people do. They leave marks that we can't always interpret, so when your things move without hands, listen to the silence they leave behind. Apparitions and orbs, solid shapes and lights where none should be. A father alone in a lake cabin. He reported seeing, or what he insists were, small round lights hovering over the tree line, drifting like lanterns without strings. One night, he watched them drop low and gather at the water's edge. When he rowed out to where they seemed to sit, the surface showed nothing but his own reflected face and a ring of cold water that blurred the stars. Weeks after, his daughter woke screaming about fireflies that talked. He still keeps the cabin door locked. A night shift nurse in a small town hospital. She says a patient's room at 2 a.m. would fill with a soft white glow. Nurses would enter to find a translucent figure standing by the bed, arms folded. The figure never looked at staff, but seemed to nod as if approving of something only it could see. The nurse chalked it up to grief-induced fatigue until a physician's assistant confessed he'd also seen the same shape on a slow night. The hospital's security logs showed no unauthorized entries. A renter in an apartment complex. He claimed a shadow would pass by the living room wall in the shape of a tall man wearing a hooded cloak. The shadow moved with purpose and paused at the staircase as if listening. Once it hovered in front of the child's bedroom door, and a vibration hummed through the house, like the low answer of an engine far away. The tenant installed night vision cameras and captured a column of darkness moving across the hall that lasted for 10 seconds and left behind nothing. He keeps a lamp on in the hallway now, a woman who grew up in an old row house. She remembers finding a little girl sitting at the foot of her grandmother's bed, looking worn and dusty. The girl said nothing, only held out a small, muddy stone. The grandmother told her not to take things from strangers, and the girl vanished slowly as if sinking through paint. The witness kept the stone for 17 years. It warmed and cooled at irregular intervals as if breathing. She put it in a sock drawer and only takes it out on days when the house feels particularly cold. A man working late in an antique bookstore. He reported orbs of light that drifted between shelves, ignoring his flashlight. Once, an orb hovered inches from his face and then contracted into what looked like a child's hand, pressing against his mug of coffee. No heat, no pressure, just a smear of light like wax. When he put his hand out, the air ran thin, as if someone had sucked the warmth out of the room. He left the lights on after that and began locking the store earlier. A family who moved into a century-old bungalow. They began to notice a recurring silhouette standing at the foot of the stairs at dawn. Always the same tilt of the head. One night the father filmed from the kitchen and, on playback, the silhouette appears and turns its head toward the camera, revealing the faint outline of eyes where none should be. The mother insists the figure only appears when the house is quiet, and when interrupted, it seems to step back into the woodwork. They keep toys scattered near the stairs now to deter it, or so they say. A college student living with 3 roommates. They reported a dark figure that would sit on the edge of their beds at night, never coming closer than a foot. One roommate joked it was a brooding roommate from another era. The figure, they say, tapped each person's shoulder 3 times before leaving. For the one who woke and heard the taps, there were scratches the next morning on the inside of the closet, noticeable only in certain light. They each swore they felt colder when the taps came. A night watchman at a cemetery. He says lights floated between the stones, bobbing like small stars. Once, an orb hovered at ground level and expanded into the faint outline of a child kneeling, then folded back into a point of light. He felt watched for the first time in his life and left his post early the following night, citing a stomach bug. He drove home with the radio on and a hand over the lock. A woman who worked in a daycare. She reported tiny faces in the hallway light, glossy, spherical orbs that seemed to pulse when the children were quiet. One night, a night nurse reported that the orbs lined up along the windows and watched the children sleep. When the daycare license inspector came the next day, she asked if they had ever had problems with lighting, as if the orbs were an electrical issue. The staff smiled and changed the subject. A widow in a coastal town. She remembers a robed figure at the edge of her yard during the fog hour, leaning on an invisible staff. The figure had no face, only a suggestion of a hood, and it seemed to take in the distance the way someone might watch children playing. The widow kept her curtains closed afterward and woke often to the creak of the porch swing, as if waiting for someone who would never return. She swears the figure once placed a single smooth pebble on her stoop. Hostbridge. Shadows and lights break the rules of our rooms. They're not always loud. Sometimes the most unsettling presence is a patient, watching silence. We've reached the point where ordinary objects and vague shapes stop being polite. The next stories push harder, things that move with intention, faces that don't belong, and one witness who woke to find a message left under her pillow. The reports begin to pile up. The texture of the ordinary starts to fray. A librarian closing up late. She reported books rearranging themselves overnight into an order no one taught her, titles stacked into a pattern that, when read front to back, spelled what she calls a name. The next day, a single page torn from an old journal lay on her desk, edges blackened, as if it had been burned and then saved. She took the page home and hid it in a drawer where it impossible to display. She never did find out whose name the book spelled. A barista working morning shift. He says cups would slide off the shelf in a perfectly measured rhythm at 4:44 a.m. on Tuesday mornings. Once, while scrubbing a counter, he watched a steaming cup lift slightly and then set itself down in a different spot. He took the cup home, and it left a ring on his kitchen table that could not be wiped out with water. He frames the ring on his wall and pretends it's art. A couple who recorded strange radio interference. They claimed the baby monitor would pick up static, then a child counting forwards and then backwards, the numbers overlapping and stretched like taffy. When they sped up the recording, a whisper underneath completed a sentence. "You left the door." The couple began checking locks more than they had before. Their final note. The monitor was replaced, but when guests come, the new device sometimes plays old recordings. They stopped telling their friends about the sounds. A janitor who found handprints in frost. He worked nights and says he came in after a snow and found small, perfectly spaced handprints on the inside of the storeroom window, facing the aisle like someone had written a message they refused to share. He cleaned the glass, but the next night the prints were back. He drew a chalk circle around them once and said the prints stayed just outside the circle. He points to an old calendar on his wall sometimes and says the hands began the week of the first snowfall and never stopped. A man living in a split-level house. He says the attic hatch would open and close twice each night. He sat up once and watched the hatch give a soft groan and then slam. He climbed up into the crawl space with a flashlight and found a child's paper airplane lodged against a beam, its tip scored by something metallic like a nail. The plane had no signature. He keeps a cross nailed over the attic hatch now, a woman whose blender would run at 3 a.m. She said she unplugged every appliance before bed and still woke to the blender whirring on the kitchen counter at a low, insistent hum. Once she turned on the light and watched the blades move, though the jar was empty. The hum seemed to fade when she hummed back. The blender is boxed in her closet and wrapped in a towel, a retired couple with a hallway of portraits. They reported that the eyes in their ancestral portraits would sometimes seem to follow the same person through the hall. At night, they heard a soft, slow tutting sound, like a tongue clicking against teeth. The wife swore a portrait of a girl on the landing shifted. A braid in the painting appeared longer the next morning. They would not repaint that landing for fear of disrupting whatever had begun. A college student whose dorm computer typed alone. He woke to a paragraph on his screen. "We were right behind you." The keys had been pressed in slow, deliberate strokes. He unplugged the machine and took it to the lab where techs found no remote access. They suggested pranks. He suggested getting out of the dorm at night. He started sleeping in the library, a family with a backroom toy chest. They reported toys that rearranged themselves into scenes, dolls seated and facing a stuffed bear, blocks stacked into towers that looked like teeth. Once a plastic wolf was found with its mouth pried open and a paper heart tucked inside. The mother keeps the chest locked and says she hears the lid sigh in the night, a landscaper who found footprints on the attic floor. He says he boarded up a small window after a break-in and later found tiny footprints mapped across the dusty rafters, 2 tracks leading from the window to a corner where toys had been stacked long ago. He doesn't believe in ghosts, he told friends. He believes in things that have not yet been explained. He took pictures and sent them to a local historian who said the home was once a schoolhouse. The landscaper left the prints where they were. Hostbridge, objects keep repeating gestures until they're recognized. Somewhere between a missing sock and a whispered name, people began to ask whether the house was a backdrop or an actor, a woman who woke to her closet breathing. She says she was half asleep when the breath came plain, long, slow, warm against her cheek, though the air in the room was cold. She lifted her head and watched the closet door wiggle as if something inside had exhaled. Her hands found the edge of the mattress and held on until dawn. In the cup by her bedside lay a small, damp smear like a thumbprint, invisible in daylight but there at night. A host bridge that tightens tone. These next accounts step closer to persistence, stalking presences, repeated trespass. Sleep is the thin place between the world you know and the one that borrows your furniture. We'll begin to meet people who felt watched in daylight as much as in midnight. We're pausing here, with rooms still warm, closets half open, and a handful of cameras pointed at empty chairs. The next set of accounts will move beyond objects and shapes, toward people who followed, who should not have been there, and nights that never quite left the witnesses alone. Stay with me as the air tightens. There are more reports ahead that make the ordinary feel like a glare in the dark. A woman living alone in a 3-bedroom bungalow. She found the first note tucked under a windshield wiper on a foggy morning. Nice parking. The handwriting was cramped and patient. She tossed it into the glove compartment and forgot it until the next week, when another note slid under her door at night. I like the way you hang your lights. That time, the ink had smudged as if written with a shaking hand. She started checking the windows before sleep. The third note arrived in an envelope with no stamp. Inside, a Polaroid of her mailbox, taken from across the street, time-stamped 3 minutes earlier. At first she told herself it was a prank. Then a neighbor she barely knew stopped her one afternoon and asked, head lowered, "You're getting those notes too, right?" He'd found a folded scrap on his doorstep with the same cramped hand. The woman called the police. Officers took the photographs and made a report. They suggested she park in different places and vary her routes to work. She did. The notes kept coming, slipped into shoeboxes, tucked under a doormat, placed in the pocket of a jacket she hadn't worn since spring. Once, a small bundle of dried lavender was left on her kitchen table with a note, "For quiet nights." Phone calls followed. At first they were heavy breathing and silence, then a voice that claimed to be just around the corner would breathe a list of mundane things about her day. You bought milk. You called your sister. You wore the blue sweater. It knew the shape of ordinary choices. The woman changed numbers. The calls continued, sometimes showing up as blocked, sometimes as a number that revealed only a city code she didn't recognize. Alarm systems were installed. Cameras went up on eaves and inside by the front door. At 2 in the morning, one camera captured a shadow moving at the curb. A figure stooped low, hands in pockets, moving like someone measured not to be noticed. The footage went to the police. There was no face. There was only the long, patient knot of movement the witness described as waiting to be looked at and then dissolving. Her friends urged her to stay with someone, to let house-sitter the house, to stay in hotels. She tried. The feeling did not follow when she slept elsewhere, but the notes did. Once a letter arrived addressed to her but left on a bench at the transit station she took to work. The envelope contained a single sentence in the same cramped script. You are easy to find. She found comfort in small defenses, motion sensor lights, a heavier deadbolt, a new ringtone that made her breathe when the phone vibrated. And yet there remained that strange intimacy of the notes, details sewn into small envelopes that said someone had watched the small map of her days and traced the familiar edges. For months, she lived inside the tidy ritual of checking doors and scanning windows. She took to lighting more candles at night to feel the flame between herself and the street. The final note. She moved out slowly, quietly, leaving the house and the notes in a stack on the counter for the next occupant. She kept one of the Polaroids folded in a drawer, face down, unread. Final note. The writer of the notes was never identified. The witness reports stalking and harassment, details withheld for safety. A 23-year-old college student on a first date. He met a woman on a dating app and thought her nervousness was charming. They drank coffee under a street lamp and then walked along a river. She laughed at his jokes and told vivid stories about her childhood in a nearby town. At the end of the night, she kissed him on the cheek and asked if she could come up for 10 minutes to see the view from his rooftop. He said yes. 10 minutes became an hour. She moved around his apartment with a familiarity he did not own. When he suggested she leave, gently, the mood shifted. Her voice went small and sharp. She asked, almost pleading, why he would consider shutting her out after a night like this. He walked her to the door. She followed him into the hallway and then into the elevator when he said he would call her a cab. She assumed she would be a story he told his roommate in the morning. That night, he received a text from an unknown number. "Don't make me come back." The message included a picture of the apartment door, taken from the stairwell. The timestamp showed the photo taken while she was 3 floors below his floor, they later discovered. He called her. The line clicked and then a whisper said his name, close enough that he could hear the cloth of someone's breath. He went to the lobby, but there was no one waiting. A neighbor later confessed to seeing a woman loitering in the hall and asked if she could be asked to leave. The student didn't want to make a scene. The police were reluctant to act without a clear threat. He switched his locks and began sleeping with his phone under his pillow. She would not be put away by simple measures. Flowers arrived at his door with a note, "For the man who opened the window to the night." They were left with no return address. A classmate found a folder of photographs under her desk. Pictures of the student taken in lecture halls and on the quad, each with a date scrawled in the bottom corner. He never saw her again at school. But sometimes, when he walked at night, a figure in a coat would stand on the far side of the green and watch the lighted windows of the dorms, as if harvesting their silhouettes. Final note. The account reads like the slow pressure of someone who refuses a boundary. The witness reported harassment and asked that names be withheld. A delivery driver on a rural evening route. He prided himself on knowing the lanes by heart, left at the mill, past the white birches, down to the curve by the burned-out tractor. He started to notice headlights arriving 5 minutes after he closed the back of his truck. A car rolling up the drive, idling with high beams on, always pulling away too quickly when he glanced at it through the mirrors. Once, after his shift, he found tire tracks in the grass that matched his own path but ended where his driveway met the road, and then continued along the shoulder, circling his house. His black Labrador refused to go out into the yard after dusk. The dog would plant himself on the stoop and stare into the trees until his eyes went wide and the fur along his spine rose. The driver found this unnerving because the dog never misread the woods. It had chased raccoons and foxes and once protected him from a loose deer. The dog would whine and pace and settle only when the porch light burned out the dark. Notes started to appear folded under the windshield wipers of his truck. "Nice shift. We know your route." The driver began driving with a second set of keys in his pocket and parking in different locations each night. He asked a co-worker to ride with him one evening. The co-worker fell asleep in the cab. At midnight, the co-worker woke to his own phone buzzing and a photo of the truck taken from the side, a dark silhouette leaning over the hood. They found scuff marks on the back bumper the next morning, scrapes not there the night before. When he reported it, the local sheriff laughed it off as crate fillers and bored teens. Then they found a length of red ribbon tied in a knot beneath his porch step and a child's single shoe placed neatly at the foot of his back stairs. The driver checked the recordings from the dashboard camera and watched a frame of his yard 3 nights running, the camera catching only a smear of shadow, like someone exhaling into the night, then the image skipping as if the camera had been briefly blinded by something that surfaced and fled. Final note: the driver kept the dog close and the truck in the garage. The porch shoe remained until spring. Hostbridge. People who watch do not always come with a face. Sometimes they leave handwriting and small tokens instead of footprints. The next group shifts away from human persistence toward the sudden, elemental threats that arrive without malice, but with the same quiet intent. Storms, trees, lightning. There are stories where the weather itself feels like a witness. A family of 4 on a highway during a late summer storm. They were returning from a lake trip when the sky folded into a wall of sound. Rain hammered the windshield in a single, relentless voice. Visibility dropped to a halo. Wind shoved the minivan sideways, and then, with a sound like a closing door, a giant maple began to fall across the road ahead. The father braked hard. The vehicle slid. Metal screamed, but somehow they came to a stop with inches to spare. The tree crashed across the asphalt where the hood had been moments before. They stepped out, shaking and wet, and watched the trunk split like a struck drum. At the base of the fallen maple, embedded in the tangle of roots and leaves, lay an old tin child's lunchbox, dented, the paint flaked, a faded astronaut painted on the lid. The little boy reached out and lifted it, as if it had been placed there on purpose. Inside, wrapped in wax paper, was a pocket-sized photograph of a child, standing in front of the same tree. Decades older, the face almost entirely faded by age. The family did not know anyone who matched the picture, and the highway patrol reported the tree had no sign of rot and had been inspected months earlier. That night in a hotel, the mother woke to the sound of rain on the roof and the smell of wet wood, like the familiar scent of the lake house. She thought she heard laughter outside the door, small, urgent, then gone. They chalked it up to adrenaline. Yet years later, when the father drives the stretch past the fallen maple, he slows down and feels the same conditioned pause at the sight of the split trunk. The child carries the lunchbox on trips sometimes, an odd talisman that clangs against the car seat as if reminding them of what they missed. Final note. Weather can be sudden and precise. The family keeps the dented lunchbox and treats it like a relic that nearly saved them by timing. A solo boater on a wide inland lake. He was out on the water at dusk, motoring back toward shore, as storm clouds bruised the horizon. The sky went black in a sweep. Wind ran fingers across the lake like someone testing a string instrument. He felt the first electric smell, sharp and metallic in the air. The radio fizzed and then went dead. He saw a white line strike the water not far from the stern. Lightning, he thought, but it did something that weather should not do. The bolt hit the surface and then hung there, a sheet of light that did not immediately dissipate but pulsed and then rolled like a slow tide across the waves. The boat shuddered. Electronics blinked, then came back with warped voices on the speaker, words that overlapped in different speeds. He recalls a sense of time thickening. 5 heartbeats stretched where he could count them, each one like a chapter. His GPS spun and then locked for a moment on a coordinate that, when he checked later, registered as a patch of marsh with no man-made features. As the storm slid past, an orb of light rose from the water near where the bolt had hit. It hovered, about the size of a basketball, translucent and cold, then drifted alongside the boat for a while before ascending into the clouds and disappearing as if swallowed. He made it to shore with the engine coughing and the decks soaked in silt. The smell of ozone clung to his clothes. That night he dreamed of hands, pale, dripping, pressing against the underside of the hull as if urging it back upright. Some friends called it a rare atmospheric glitch. He calls it the night the lake remembered him. Final note. He keeps a small scrap of the boat's paint in his pocket when he works. It smells faintly of salt and electricity. Housebridge, storms don't only break trees and flip signs, sometimes they reveal things that were waiting in the dark. After wind and water come other shapes, those that protect and those that watch, often delivered through animals or long-held family routines. An elderly woman on a farm with a border collie. Her neighbors called the dog uncanny. It refused to sleep in the guest cottage and would not cross under the kitchen's low rafters. The collie occasionally growled at a patch of sun on the floor where nothing stood, or it would sit at the top of the cellar steps and whine in a way the woman said sounded like a name. She had been alone since her husband died, and sometimes she woke crying with the sense of someone sitting on the edge of the bed who had a voice like his. Once during a winter when the well froze and the pipes burst, she awoke to her living room lit by a small, steady glow over the mantel. She later described a dream where her mother, who had died 20 years ago, stood by the mantel with her skirts wet, as if from river reeds, and placed a tin of sewing needles into the woman's hands. The next morning, in the drawer where she stored old buttons, she found that same tin, unopened, though she had never owned anything like it. The collie had been pacing by the drawer the entire night. The woman told a niece about the tin and the dog's odd behavior. The niece replied, and this is the part that stilled her voice, that the woman's mother had been known to make tiny gifts for sewing when she was alive, little tins handed out to the whole family on winter days. The niece had a faded photograph of the mother in a shawl, needles in hand. Sometimes the dog would walk down the lane at dusk and pause by the fence, nose straining, tail held rigid, then return to the house as if it had been given an order. The woman stopped sleeping with the radio on, preferring instead to hear the small, steady breathing of the collie at the foot of the bed. She began to leave a small dish of warm milk at the mantel some nights. For company, she said. The collie would lick it, and then sit back and watch the dark with an expression the woman described as thankful. Final note. For her, the presence felt less like intrusion and more like watchfulness. She believes an ancestor keeps the land in quiet reach, a middle-aged antiques collector in a narrow townhouse. She had always collected dolls, bisque and composition, hands smoothed by other people's fingers, eyes that blinked or stared depending on the light. She kept them on a high shelf in the parlor, each with a small card noting origin and date. One winter, after a neighbor's basement flooded, a child age unknown died in an accident several towns over. The collector read about it in the paper and found herself thinking, oddly, of one particular doll with a braided mohair wig. On a Tuesday at dusk, she came home and found a doll she'd never owned, suspended by the hair from the closet rod in her bedroom. It hung at an angle, light stealing the paint from its cheeks, as if the air itself had drained color. The hair, long, synthetic and knotted, had been braided and then tied into a loop. The doll's dress was old, patched, smelling of the attic's dry rot. The collector insisted she had no keys to any of the doll shops in town and hadn't traded with anyone recently. She did, however, keep a ledger of trades and catalogued each new piece with the care of an archivist. She cried when she found the doll because the face, though generic, held the expression of someone stunned awake. She cut it down with trembling hands and put it back in the closet, clothes neat, hair smoothing under her fingers like a ritual. The next morning the doll lay on the bed, dress slightly ruffled as if it had been turned over in sleep. The collector questioned neighborhood kids, called the pawn shops, and wrote to other collectors. No one claimed the doll. After a week of small events, the radio playing a lullaby from a station that shouldn't have a signal, a child's laugh caught on a recorder in the pantry, she decided to conduct a small, quiet removal. She took the doll to a funeral of sorts, wrapped it in tissue paper, drove to the edge of town, and left it on the steps of an old chapel whose doors were always locked. 2 days later, a postcard arrived with no return address. On the front was a child's drawing of a house with a single window. On the back, in small handwriting, "Thank you for watching her." She did not tell anyone she received it. Final note: she never catalogued that doll in her ledger. Sometimes the house feels like a collection left breathing. Hostbridge. Objects can be threats or messengers. They can weigh the same on the chest. We head now to the heaviest accounts. Long, sustained hauntings with motion and voice. Episodes that stretched over weeks and left families changed. A single father in a split-level home with a daughter aged 9. They had moved into the house because of the neighborhood school district and because the backyard had a swing. The daughter, May, loved dolls. She had a shelf of porcelain that her grandmother had given her, faces with painted lashes, eyes that glinted like small moons. One evening during the storm season, the father tipped the shelves and counted them before bed. He woke to a sound he could not place, a tiny, desperate scraping like fingernails on plaster. The porch light was on. The dolls were not where he'd left them. May came to him from the hallway, white-faced, and whispered that one of her dolls couldn't sleep. It was a strange way to say it, a child's phrase that made his stomach drop like a stone. He found the doll, Lydia, small, with a blue dress, hanging by her hair from the closet rod, hair looped in a knot that made the doll's head tilt like a pendulum. The father cut it down with a kitchen knife. The knot was precise, the hair itself threaded in a way that took patience. He called it an accident at first, a child's prank or May's rough play, but May had been at school the whole day. Over the next month, things escalated. The dolls would be arranged on the staircase, seated as if waiting for something to pass. At night, May reported hearing little steps in the floor above her bed, and at dawn would find small footprints of flour leading from the hallway into the small closet under the stairs. One morning, the father opened that closet and found a tiny makeshift bed, scraps of fabric, and a crocheted cap. He did not own a crocheted cap. The father set up a camera inside the closet. A week of footage showed nothing but dust and the slow transit of dust motes. Then, at 2 in the morning, the camera captured a shift. No human form, but the dolls on the shelf seeming to lean forward, a motion too synchronous to be the creep of floorboards. For a heartbeat, the camera imaged a darkness where the closet should be, like someone had breathed the light out of the frame. It lasted for 5 seconds. In the audio track there was a sound, soft, almost a child's breath, and at the very end the father swore he heard May's name spoken in syllables that were warped and not entirely right. He froze the frame and found, if he squinted, what looked like 2 small fingers pressed against the inside of the closet door. They tried rational remedies, moving the dolls, taking them to the garage, giving them away. Each time the dolls returned to the shelf within days, neatly lined and facing the same way. Once he left a note taped to the closet door. "Stop." The next morning, the note had been peeled back and rewritten in crayon. "I want to play." The father then began to feel less like someone defending his house and more like someone negotiating. He blocked May's closet with a chest and kept the bedroom door open at night, listening for the scrape of small nails. On one particularly long night, he dreamt a girl with hair the color of stale bread standing at the foot of the bed and whispering until his ears rang. They moved, not because they were scared of a story, but because May stopped sleeping well. The father sold the shelf and put the dolls in a box in the attic of the new house. Weeks later, May woke at 2 in the morning, pointing toward a box she had not taken down, and said plainly, "She wants me to bring her home." The father wrapped his arms around May and told her no, but he could not find the words to explain why the voice of the night sounded so like something calling his daughter's name. Final note: the dolls were never found hanging again. The father keeps the attic box nailed shut, but says the sound of small feet haunts the place between their walls. A young woman renting a small room in an old multi-story house. She had spent her 20s moving and settling and moving again. The room was cheap, the rent covered the utilities. She accepted that it had quirks. The floorboard that dipped near the foot of the bed, the closet door that stuck in humidity. For months there were small things, keys disappearing, brushes left in the wrong place, until one morning she awoke with a weight on her chest and the feeling of someone kneeling beside the bed. She opened her eyes and saw a little girl standing in the doorway of the closet, soaked as if from rain, hair plastered to her face. The girl did not speak, but pointed at the wooden floor. At first she assumed it was a dream, a hypnopompic leftover from sleep. She told a roommate who shrugged and said houses that age had drafts and that she was making too much soup. The girl, however, recurred. Each night the occupant heard a soft tapping at the closet door, a rhythm like a child's fingernails drumming out a code. Sometimes objects were moved at her desk, paper cups rearranged into a ring, a pencil in the shape of a cross. Once the front-facing mirror in the hallway fogged from the inside, and a child's handprint formed and then faded. Time stitched the events into a pattern. The occupant began to keep a notebook beside the bed and would wake sometimes to find a new sentence on the page written in pencil with force. "Play with me." She never took the pen to write it. Once the room shook with a noise like laughter, sharp and surprised. The closet door swung open and slammed shut twice. The woman's cat, normally aloof, retreated under the couch and did not leave for hours. She installed a camera and watched hours of footage of empty air until one 3-second clip showed the silhouette of a small head bowing, as if looking down at something on the floor. When she froze the frame, she swore the silhouette's hair glinted with what looked like wetness. She tried to be practical. She placed a small blanket inside the closet floor and a toy bear, as if to make the presences less lonely. The next morning the blanket was folded perfectly, the bear seated against the wall. She considered leaving notes in the closet, "We don't play tonight," but lacked the nerve, worrying that a message could be read in other ways. A neighbor told her the house had once sheltered a runaway child decades earlier who had never been found. The woman kept that detail folded up like an ache and took to sleeping with the closet light on, the glow painting the room an exhausted yellow. Final note: she left eventually. But before she moved out, she found, inside the closet, a child's shoe tucked neatly behind a box, mud still clinging to the sole. Host Bridge. The last 3 stories are the ones listeners tend to replay. They are not short chills. They are long, slow, unspooling nights that feel like a lived-in dream. Accounts that leave marks and ask you to listen for small sounds after you turn out your light. A retired carpenter in a 3-story Victorian with a keepsake room. He kept his wife's things in a locked cabinet, the small, delicate things she had collected across 50 years. One autumn, he discovered the cabinet ajar and several items removed. A silk handkerchief, a child's worn sock, and a porcelain doll he had bought for their daughter decades earlier. He found the doll in the attic, suspended from a nail at the apex of the rafters, its arms through the loop as if hanging on an invisible hanger. The doll's wig had been woven into a rope-like braid and tied so tight the porcelain face tilted down to one side. He swears he did not put it there. He had not gone into the attic in months. When he took the doll down, the braid unspooled under his hands like centuries of thread, the hair catching on his fingers and leaving a residue of varnish. He placed the doll on the kitchen table and sat with his hands around his coffee, the radio small and forgotten. That night he woke to the warm, stale smell of varnish and old glue, smells that belonged to his wife's workbench. The doll was not on the table. He drove back to the house, a child's terror squeezing his chest. The front door was locked. He managed to unlatch it, and the kitchen light came on. On the doorway between the kitchen and the stairwell, the doll hung again, but this time from the chain of the ceiling light, hair wound tight and face turned toward the wall. In the photograph he later showed a friend, The doll's dress glowed with a faint ashy halo, as if part of the shadow itself held colour. The carpenter called his son. They talked about pranks and drafts and the natural settling of old houses. The son suggested the man sell the doll to a collector. The father refused. He believed the doll had been moved by hands that were not human or by an accumulation of gestures that gathered into emotion. The pacing of the events tightened, choreographed in a way that suggested intention rather than chaos. One night he installed a bell on the attic door. It rang twice at 3 a.m. When he opened it, the doll lay face down on the floorboards as if searching for something. Neighbors reported a childlike humming heard from the eaves on certain nights. The carpenter heard the exact tune once while sitting at his kitchen table, a lullaby his wife used to hum to their grandchild. Nobody could explain how an old voice might return through the rafters like a rehearsal. The carpenter, advancing in years, began to speak to the doll aloud, asking if it wanted to be set somewhere safe. Once he claims he heard a reply that was not in words, but in the sensation of being watched from inside the house. Final note: he locked the doll in a trunk and then moved the trunk to the attic. But he says sometimes he thinks he feels the house's weight shift, as if the object was again finding its way. A mother in a small duplex with a daughter named June. They had moved in because it was near better schools, and because the neighborhood had old elms that draped the sidewalk in shade. June loved closets and the small, secretive things found inside them. On a late winter night, the mother heard a soft sobbing come from June's room. She went to check. June was in bed, sheets pulled to her chin, but June's closet door lay open, and the small chair inside had a small outline, like a child's hand, pressed into the fabric of the seat. The mother told herself it was a blanket folded oddly. June, eyes half closed, frowned and said, "She's lonely because her hair is short." June's speech shifted after that. She began to talk about an unnamed playmate who lived behind the coats. She drew pictures of a small girl with short hair and a patchwork dress. During the day, the neighbor from down the hall mentioned a woman who had once lived in the house with a child, that the child had left town with a relative, and sometimes people said the house never quite let go. The mother bought new hangers, a nightlight for the closet, and a small cedar chest to close the space. The child would not enter her closet without protesting. On a Tuesday, the mother found a note under June's pillow in pencil, letters uneven. "I need your hair." She asked June where it had come from. June shrugged and said she didn't know, and that a little girl had asked politely, and she had put the note away. The mother called her sister and asked what to do. The sister suggested it might be a stage, a phase, a child's fantasy after reading too many stories. They did not suspect the depth of what followed. One evening, the mother woke hearing a whisper close to her ear. "Play with me." It was a voice that sounded like air moving through a thin straw. She turned on the light, and the closet door was open. Inside lay an old knitting basket with a half-completed cap. On the seat of the small chair was a braid of hair, short plaited strands knotted in a child's way. She could tell by the texture it did not belong to June. The braid was damp and smelled faintly of the river. She placed the braid in a jar and carried it to her sister. When she returned late that night, the jar sat on the mantel and the braid lay on the chest, as if someone had taken it out to admire. The woman's hand shook. They considered counseling. They considered moving. They installed a baby monitor for the closet that would record sound without showing pictures. For 10 nights, the monitor recorded nothing but the house's normal hum. On the 11th night, at 2:01, the audio picked up a soft voice singing an old nursery rhyme that neither mother nor daughter recognized. The voice was thin, but it ended with a whisper, clear enough to chill. "Your hair will be the same color as mine." They left the house soon after and stored the braid in a sealed envelope at the bottom of a moving box. June sometimes wakes at night now and asks for her old closet, as if something loved the dark wood there. The mother keeps a pair of scissors in a drawer and sleeps with the light in the hallway on. Final note: the family moved. Items left in the closet were boxed and given away. The braid remained sealed in a moving box. Hostbridge. Homes are porous things. People move houses, but not always the things that live inside them. Some inhabitants stay with you like a cold spot, a draught, a name whispered at the edge of sleep. Tonight we end with one last quiet story, a final small shiver to take into your own darkness. A woman who once worked the night shift at a children's convalescent center. She had been a nurse for years and said she had seen the ordinary cruelties of illness and the stubborn bravery of small bodies, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for a December when doors would creak without wind and toys would be found arranged facing the foot of a bed in a ward that had been cleared for Halloween decoration. There was one patient, a little girl who had been transferred in from another hospital, who spoke rarely and clung to a small braided barrette. The girl said she saw someone in the closet who liked to hum. On the night the building lost power for a stretch, the nurse, used to the dim and small, made rounds with a flashlight and a sweater over her shoulders. She checked the rooms, shone the light on the little girl's window, and the child smiled and said, "She's gone to sleep." Later, in the break room, the nurse sipped cold coffee and reviewed charts when she saw movement on a security monitor, a tiny hand slipping between a closet door and the jamb of the supply closet across the hall. The hand did not belong to a known patient. It was small and pale, and appeared to be tugging at a rope of something that draped just out of frame. She went to the supply closet and found the door closed. Inside a mobile, one of those tiny hanging toys had been rearranged so its figures dangled upside down. The nurse said she felt an old chill lift her skin like the rubbing of moth wings. The child admitted later in a whisper that the visitor liked to wear all the coats and that sometimes the dolls in the toy chest woke up to dance. Months later, after she had transferred to a day shift and the little girl had gone home, the nurse found a small, folded piece of paper in a drawer of the supply closet. It was a child's drawing of a room with a closet and a small figure standing behind a curtain. At the bottom, carefully written, was a sentence. "Thank you for watching." The nurse pressed the paper between the pages of a Bible in her locker, though she did not call it prayer. She left the center eventually and kept the folded note in a locket she wears sometimes. When she tells the story now, she chooses her words carefully. Some listeners nod and understand the ache of small voices. Others ask for proof. She offers none. She prefers the way the image lingers, the idea of tiny hands that tidy and threads of memory tying a child to a thing that keeps quiet watch. Final note: she still checks closets at night, out of habit now more than fear, and sometimes leaves a small toy on a shelf in case, for reasons she cannot fully name. A closing reflection from the narrator. 50 reported accounts, 50 nights where something small and patient rearranged the maps of lives. Some of these things walked and left footprints, some were storm and timing, some were hands that warmed or hair that braided itself into a noose. Whatever one believes about the cause, there is a shared consequence. People's sleep was broken, their routines altered, a sense of the ordinary stripped and hung out like laundry in the cold. These are listener reports, personal testimonies edited for clarity and flow. Some have police reports, some have photographs, some remain private and stubbornly personal. We have not named private individuals or included graphic detail. We have preserved the sense of each witness's fear without prurient curiosity. If any account resonated because it involved harassment or danger, readers are encouraged to seek local support resources. In the video description, you'll find information and hotlines. If you are currently in danger, please contact local authorities or a trusted person. One last small image before we close. A doll's head turned toward the wall, a closet door breathing out, a child's drawing left where you can find it in the dark. Keep those pictures in your head as you switch off the lights. They are lightweight things until you are alone with them. If one of these stories kept you awake, leave which one in the comments. Share a memory or a short experience. And if you've lived through something like this, you're not alone. Thank you for listening.